lowers the power of the state security services, and really, makes them uh, a class of people that share in this great wealth. To refer to a great old book that was published in 1967 by the late great economist John Kenneth Galbraith, the New Industrial State, he referenced this term which he called the technocracy. The technocracy, and what Galbraith, for some of your younger viewers, I mean, Galbraith was this giant in the field of economics in the middle of the 20th century. He was at Harvard all the way up until the end. He was about 101 or something when he passed. Originally a Canadian farmer, and always did economics from the perspective of what he thought was the public interest. But at any rate, quite unlike perhaps what you might see today. He asserted that that society is comprised of this class of managers. They're the ones who are really running things, and that you could not let, if you wanted social cohesion and stability, you could not let certain sectors of the technocracy be marginalized or pushed to the side. So, in other words, if you're going to have a class of oligarchs, you could not have other members of the managerial class all living like paupers. They just wouldn't tolerate it. So, in a sense, what Putin does is he starts bringing other select sectors of that managerial class into this scheme to share in the wealth that Russia still produces. And I'm referring, of course, to the security services. So,
Yes, exactly.
they're going to be made rich, many of them.
Yeah, I mean that's the point I was just going to say, is that in a sense Putin is the bridge. He's the
Oh
bridge
yeah,
between the intelligence services, the KGB apparatchiks, that whole state security class, and the oligarch class, and he basically is in a sense kind of the bridge between those two worlds. And in just as you mentioned, the idea of his bringing stability, which is actually what the most of the myth of Putin is based on, the idea that he kind of stabilized this wild west of the 1990s and sort of returned Russia to a kind of safe, whatever, political and economic space. That is built on this idea of sort of marrying these contradictory forces into what they now call the sistema, right? Which is the Russian system, whereby Putin stands at the center, juggling all these competing forces, and represents kind of, I don't know, the brain of it or whatever.
right. And of course, that was quite welcomed at first by many people, of course, given the trauma of the 1990s. But what Putin either never could figure out or did not want to figure out because of the implications of that was to how to create some greater degree of dynamism. The same challenge that Gorbachev and Andropov observed: how to create some greater. I mean, he wanted it both ways. He wanted to preserve this system that he created of institutionalized corruption, and at the same time, he wanted to introduce some degree of dynamism in the economy, understanding that without that, I mean, ultimately you perish. And that's something that the last decade has revealed, is that he just was unable to resolve or to square that set of contradictions. So it was a kind of we can refer to this, I think, as the Putin neoliberal model, right? I mean, so, and we see that in terms of the central bank and how they were always advocates of more kind of neoliberal policies, which Putin, I think, was more or less inclined to support and did, but none of this generated the unleashing of economic potential, which they thought that maybe it could. We saw this idea that Russia was going to create its own MIT, and there was actually even a formal relationship between them, and that didn't. I mean, there were all of these efforts that just did not pay off, in part because of insufficient investment But other factors as well. If I could just return to just one quick point though before we, I know our time is short. Uh, I, 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 I kind of argue in the article that by the time Gorbachev finds himself at the helm of the Soviet Union, that it would have been damn near impossible to reform it. And so we can't lay the blame at his feet. Now, I would argue that if you did want that, 1 in a million lottery chance of actually reforming it, that he undertook the wrong set of policies to achieve that end result and in the wrong order. But nonetheless, it was already too far gone, and it just did not have the same set of advantages that China had. So there's often, this tendency to compare China with the Soviet Union, and these are just completely apples and oranges. They cannot be compared. While Deng Xiaoping certainly disagreed with Gorbachev, especially with regards to glasnost, uh, as the way to reform this other Stalinist, Maoist economy in China. They just had an entirely different set of conditions. One, the United States was blowing wind into their sails. They wanted China as a hedge against the still existing Soviet Union. The United States was using China in its massive rural reserve army of cheap labor to keep profit levels up in the United States and to keep wages down in the United States by exporting or subcontracting out production to China. Uh, so it was just an entirely different situation. I mean, the Soviet Union had in the 1980s wages compared to China that were really high, actually, and it was already a nearly fully urbanized society. So there was no great reserve army of cheap labor to draw upon, and you just could not do what China successfully did in the way that they did it.
All right, I want to shift gears a little bit in the time that we have remaining, Jeff, and just first of all, I want to shift back to Gorbachev and to understanding. Well, you just made an interesting point in your previous comment that I 100% agree with, that in some senses Gorbachev really gets treated unfairly by history because of the nature of when he rises to his position, the, as you already say, sort of the entrenched inefficiencies and breakdowns, and all of the corruption and all of the things that were already present there. And on top of that, he's also saddled with a disastrous war in Afghanistan that he did not launch himself, and also the, of course, the rising class of people that we were just talking about. So I want to have a retrospective look at Gorbachev, keeping in mind all of these forces that were so much bigger than him. And it's not that I'm soft on Gorbachev, although I guess maybe I am as compared to the people who demonize him endlessly, right? But I do think that this was so much bigger than him, and he was, in some senses, maybe not powerless, but almost powerless against these forces.
Yeah, it was way bigger than him. I mean, if he had a fault, it might be that it might be vanity a little bit, uh, and I think you're right. We do judge him too harshly. I think probably the last possible chance of reforming the Soviet Union would have been when Andropov took power. And if he would have been able to last, maybe even then it was too late. But that was really the last chance. But just as you say, so you have this crisis in Afghanistan, which as we know, is in part engineered by the United States. Jimmy Carter's national security advisor is a big Brzezinski, Polish nationalist, and he says flat out in an interview in 1998 in La Figaro that he wanted to give the Soviets their own Vietnam. He wanted to take them down a peg there. And of course, Gorbachev was not interested in continuing to fight this war. He had to figure out a way to extricate himself from it. And then, of course, the United States as well had other cards to play. One was its alliance with the Saudis. And so it gets the Saudis to open up the oil spigot and take the price of oil way down, at one point, all the way down to $10 a barrel. So, the United States was able to impose some hardships on the Soviet Union, but fair enough. I mean, that's what the Soviets would do with the United States when they could as well. I mean, that's what the Cold War was about, unfortunately. But yeah, so immense challenges, and yes, Gorbachev did not use the limited bargaining power that he had with the West early enough. I mean, could he have gotten much more aid from them if he would have let the Warsaw Pact dissolve earlier? Sure, but what would he have done with that aid? What would have happened to it by the time he finally did get some aid for pulling out of the German Democratic Republic? That money just seems to have disappeared, and and then at the very end of the Soviet Union, they just couldn't even feed themselves. I mean, so it was a disaster. And again, agreeing with you, I just don't know if he could have turned it around.
Yeah, and on top of that, one of the interesting things about Gorbachev, and you make this point in the article several times, is that he was a true believer.
Oh yeah,
He
yeah,
believed in communism and socialism. He
right.
believed in Lenin and Lenin's ideas. He believed in these things, and in a sense, that almost made him out of step with his own generation of leaders, because many of the people who had risen to high positions, especially people like Putin, are notoriously anti-ideological and are not interested in all of the academics of socialism and
Oh yeah,
Marxism
right.
and
As
all
we
of that
know, I
other
mean,
stuff,
right. I mean,
So
Putin hates the Bolsheviks, right? And Brezhnev, was once asked to, in one of his speeches, quote some Lenin, and he just purportedly kind of haughtily turned to one of his aides and said, "Come on, nobody believes I read this stuff." uh, so, and the KGB was, the Soviet Union did kind of create an upper middle class, mostly Czechs. Now, Putin, of course, is not one of those guys. He comes out of the school of hard knocks and in St. Petersburg, but a lot of the Czechs were really erudite, elites that they didn't hold any regard or love for this idea of a workers' revolution. And they thought that the Soviet leadership was there through an ideological affirmative action, that they were all idiots, and that they should be replaced with someone, meaning me, them. you know, they, they thought they should be running the show.
So Gorbachev, in the last little bit of his life, of course, was in an awkward position, because while he undoubtedly had personal views on everything that was going on in Russia, he didn't express them openly for the most part, with maybe a few exceptions. And so, thinking about the fact that Gorbachev dies here in 2022, the year that Putin launches this historically disastrous war on Ukraine, I'm wondering, what do we think Gorbachev might have thought about all of this? And how do you think Gorbachev would have looked upon all of this happening? Because, as you say, he was raised by Ukrainian grandparents. He grew up in an area of Russia that is almost Ukraine. I mean, you know what I mean? To the point where your neighbors and your friends and everybody probably have friends and neighbors and relatives and so forth in Ukraine. So very connected to it. And so I guess my question is, on the one hand, what do you think he thought of this? But on the other hand, what does it tell us about where Russia has come to, the place that it has come to after all of these decades?
Well, first, of course, the war is, just as you say, it is a disaster. We don't know how it'll play out yet. On one level, it doesn't matter. I mean, what has already happened